Imagine living in Ireland back in the 16th century. Picture it. Castles and rolling green hills. But also at a time when a third of the land, was about to completely change hands, becoming the foundation of an empire. Sounds like a movie, right? But this is actually Ireland's past, and it's a past that Professor Jane Ohlmeyer unpacks brilliantly in her book, Making Empire: Ireland, Imperialism, and the Early Modern World. So today we're diving deep into that history, trying to uncover just how Ireland became England's first colony, and how that experience shaped empires that came after.
Yeah, it's a story that's often kind of overlooked or forgotten, but it's really crucial for understanding not just Ireland's past, but the dynamics of colonialism that we see resonating even today.
Yeah, we tend to think of colonialism as something that happened, far away
Mm,
on, distant continents.
yeah,
But Ireland's story reminds us that empire building often begins much closer to home.
exactly. And one of the key turning points in this story is this Kingship Act of 1541. That's where we really see the gears of empire beginning to turn.
Okay, I'm all ears. What made this act so significant? Was it like a sudden land grab, or was it something more subtle?
It was a power move, for sure, but it was definitely veiled in a lot of legal and political maneuvering. Before the act, Ireland was like this patchwork of different lordships, some Gaelic Irish, some Old English, and each had, some degree of autonomy. But the Kingship Act declared Henry VIII, the English monarch, the King of Ireland, and it transformed the island into a kingdom under the Tudor crown.
So on the surface,
Yeah.
it seems like a promotion for Ireland, right?
Yeah.
Going from, a bunch of lordships to a kingdom.
Right, that was the clever part. It was presented as this unifying measure, but the reality was that it consolidated England's control. Now, all Irish people, no matter their heritage, were subjects of the Tudor crown. So those distinctions between the Gaelic Irish and the Old English were erased, and in practice, this solidified Ireland's status as a colony, despite its new title of kingdom.
So it's almost like they were saying, we're elevating you, but you're also firmly under our thumb now. A bit of a double-edged sword, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And this tightening grip was further intensified by, the Protestant Reformation that was sweeping across Europe at the time. It wasn't just about religious conversion, it was about cultural domination.
So how did this religious upheaval play into England's ambitions in Ireland? Were they trying to force the Irish to convert?
Well, conversion was part of it, of course, but it went even deeper than that. The English viewed their embrace of Protestantism as this, you know, mark of progress, of civilization. And they viewed the Irish, who remained Catholic, as backward, barbaric.
So less about saving souls and more about imposing their own cultural values.
Precisely. It was a form of cultural imperialism. This desire to make the Irish English in every way, from their language and dress to their legal systems, even how they farmed their land. And the failure of the Reformation to really take root in Ireland just further reinforced that perception of the Irish as needing to be civilized.
A chilling example of how differences in belief can be used to justify control and domination. Sadly, a pattern we see repeated through history, isn't it?
Yeah, it certainly is. And speaking of chilling examples, we can't overlook the role of Edmund Spenser, a figure many might find a bit surprising in this context.
Wait, are we talking about the Edmund Spenser, the poet who wrote The Faerie Queen? That Edmund Spenser.
The very same. But alongside those romantic poems, he was also a colonial administrator in Ireland. His experiences there led him to write a very different kind of work, a treatise called A View of the Present State of Ireland.
So what exactly was Spenser's view of the Irish situation?
It was stark and disturbing. It was basically a call for the destruction of Irish culture, eradication. He advocated for the destruction of the Irish people and their way of life, saying that the land should be emptied and repopulated with English settlers, not just conquest, but a blueprint for cultural annihilation.
Really unsettling that someone known for artistry could advocate for such brutality. Speaks to the deeply ingrained prejudice that fueled these colonial ventures.
Yeah. Spencer's treatise actually became a sort of ideological handbook for future British colonialism, shaping attitudes and policies for centuries to come. It demonstrates just how dangerous ideas can take root and spread, even from seemingly unlikely sources.
And this drive for control, this cultural imperialism, it wasn't just theoretical. It manifested in concrete ways, on the ground in Ireland.
Absolutely. One of the most tangible and devastating manifestations was the system of plantations.
Let's talk about these plantations. What did they entail in the context of Ireland?
It was essentially a system of land confiscation and redistribution. The English seized vast tracts of Irish land and granted them to English landlords. These landlords were then expected to civilize the land by introducing English farming practices and establishing English-style settlements.
So basically erasing the existing social and economic structures,
Yeah.
replacing them with an English model.
Yeah.
Did they just take land that was unoccupied, or were they displacing people who were already there?
Very much about displacement. Over the course of the 17th century, a staggering 8 million acres, a third of the entire landmass of Ireland, changed hands. Irish families who had lived and farmed that land for generations, pushed aside, becoming tenants on their own ancestral lands.
That's an unimaginable scale of displacement. What happened to those Irish families? Where did they go? How did they survive?
It was a devastating blow to the Irish people. Many went from being landowners to tenant farmers. Subject to the whims of their new English landlords, they were often pushed to the margins of society, facing poverty and hardship. And this resentment, this feeling of being robbed of their heritage, simmered for years. It became a major factor in the rebellion that erupted in 1641.
So the plantations weren't just about economics. They were a powder keg that ignited further conflict and violence. This period in Irish history sounds incredibly turbulent. How do we even begin to understand the lives of everyday people caught in the midst of all of this?
That's where these 1641 depositions come in, these first-hand accounts, collected by the English government. They offer this glimpse into the lived experiences of ordinary people during this tumultuous time.
These depositions sound like a valuable window into the past. What kinds of stories did they tell? Are they primarily from the perspective of the English settlers?
Yes, primarily. But it's important to acknowledge that inherent bias or grade. Most of the depositions are from Protestant settlers, and their accounts are naturally shaped by their own experiences and perspectives.
Of course. Understanding that context is crucial. But even with that bias, these depositions must offer valuable insights into the social fabric of the time,
Right.
especially the experiences of women, who are often left out of those grand historical narratives.
Absolutely. The depositions offer a particularly valuable perspective on the roles and experiences of women during this period. They were on the front lines of this colonial conflict, both literally and figuratively. They really bring those experiences to life. We see women, from all walks of life, wealthy landowners, shopkeepers, servants, and they were all forced to navigate this turbulent world.
It sounds like they were facing unimaginable challenges. What kind of insights do we get from their stories?
Well, a lot of them describe the just sheer terror of the rebellion, the suddenness of their lives being upended, talking about losing their homes, their possessions, in many cases loved ones. Imagine having to flee your home in the middle of the night, not knowing where you'll find safety, if you'll ever return.
Utterly terrifying. Living with this constant sense of vulnerability and fear.
Absolutely. And the depositions also reveal this remarkable resilience of these women, having to adapt so quickly to these new circumstances, often taking on roles that were traditionally considered men's work.
That's fascinating. What kind of roles did they take on? I imagine they were stepping up in ways they never had to before.
Yeah, a lot of them became the sole providers for their families, managing farms or businesses while their husbands were away fighting, or in some cases had been killed. They had to negotiate with authorities, defend their property, sometimes even take up arms to protect themselves and their children.
It's inspiring to hear about their strength and resourcefulness in the face of such adversity. It really challenges that traditional notion of women being passive bystanders in history.
It certainly does. These depositions offer a different perspective, showing us that women were active agents in their own lives, even within the constraints of, a patriarchal society and a brutal colonial conflict.
Are there any particular stories from these depositions that stand out to you, that really encapsulate these women's experiences?
Oh, there are so many compelling accounts, but one that really stays with me is the story of Elizabeth Freak. She was a wealthy landowner who lost everything in the rebellion. Her husband was imprisoned. She had to flee her home with her children. And despite all of this hardship, Elizabeth was determined to rebuild her life. She petitioned authorities for compensation, fought legal battles to reclaim her property, and eventually succeeded in establishing a new home for herself and her family.
It's a testament to her strength and perseverance. Refused to be a victim of circumstance. Her story just captures the essence of resilience.
And her story is not unique. There are countless examples of women who displayed similar courage and determination in the face of such immense hardship.
It makes you wonder how these women's experiences shaped their views of Ireland and their place within it. Did they feel a sense of belonging, or were they always outsiders?
That's a complex question. Some women, particularly those who had been born in Ireland, clearly felt a deep connection to the land and its people. Others, especially those who had arrived more recently from England, may have always felt like outsiders, clinging to their English identity in a land that was increasingly hostile.
Sounds like they were caught between two worlds, trying to navigate their own sense of belonging in a land marked by so much conflict and division.
Exactly. And their stories also shed light on the ways in which empire impacted family structures and relationships.
How so? Did the upheaval of this period put additional strain on families?
Absolutely. The depositions are filled with accounts of families just being torn apart by this violence. Husbands and wives separated, children orphaned, families forced to flee their homes, sometimes never to be reunited.
Heartbreaking to think of the toll this must have taken on those families. The sense of loss and uncertainty they must have endured.
It underscores the fact that the human cost of empire extends far beyond, the battlefield. It reaches into the heart of homes and families, leaving lasting scars on generations to come.
We've been focusing on the impact of English colonialism on Ireland. But were there any instances of the Irish participating in empire building themselves?
That's an important point. Professor Olmeyer emphasizes that the Irish weren't simply passive victims in this story. They were active participants in various imperial ventures, across the globe, serving as soldiers in European armies, working as merchants in the Americas, even establishing their own settlements in places like the Caribbean.
So the story of Ireland and empire, more nuanced than a simple narrative of colonizer versus colonized, a complex interplay of forces at work.
Exactly. It's a story of interconnectedness, how people from, different backgrounds and cultures were both shaped by and actively shaped the forces of empire.
Makes you wonder how those experiences in other empires might have influenced the Irish people's views of their own situation back home. Did they draw any parallels or learn any lessons from what they saw happening in other parts of the world?
That's a fascinating question, and one that historians are still kind of exploring. How did those who witnessed the brutality of empire firsthand reconcile that with the realities of English rule in Ireland? Did it fuel their resistance? Or did it lead to a sense of resignation?
And how did those experiences contribute to this evolving sense of Irish identity that was emerging during this period? Seems like a time of great upheaval and transformation, both individually and collectively.
Absolutely. And Professor Olmeyer encourages us to move beyond simple binaries and consider the complexities of empire from multiple perspectives.
It reminds us that history is rarely black and white, full of shades of gray,
Yeah.
of competing narratives, and of individuals making choices within systems that often feel larger than themselves.
And that's what makes studying this period so fascinating. By delving into these complex stories, we gain a deeper understanding of the forces that have shaped our world and the enduring legacies of the past.
I'm already seeing connections between what we've learned about Ireland and other historical events and movements. It's like a whole new layer of understanding is unfolding.
That's the beauty of historical inquiry. It's not just about accumulating facts. It's about making connections, challenging assumptions, seeing the world in new and often unexpected ways.
So where do we go from here? What other insights can we glean from Professor Olmeyer's work?
Well, Professor Olmeyer emphasizes the importance of comparing Ireland's experience to other empires of the early modern period, the Spanish Habsburgs, the Ottomans, the Moguls. By looking beyond the borders of Ireland, we can gain a broader understanding of the patterns and processes of empire building.
I'm intrigued. What kind of parallels can we draw between Ireland and these other empires? Are there common threads that run through their stories?
Well, for one, we see these similar tactics of land confiscation and control being used across different empires, whether it's the English in Ireland, the Spanish in the Americas, or the Mughals in India. The seizure of land was a key element in establishing and maintaining power.
It's as if land became the currency of empire, a way to consolidate control and extract wealth. Did these different empires use similar justifications for their actions?
Often they did. Empires frequently framed their conquests in terms of bringing civilization, religion, or progress to supposedly backward or barbaric peoples.
It's a classic case of the ends justify the means,
Ah,
a dangerous and often self-serving ideology that has been used to justify countless atrocities throughout history.
absolutely. And by comparing these different empires, we start to see how these patterns repeat themselves, how certain ideologies and practices of domination become almost universal across time and space.
It's a cautionary tale, showing us how easily power can be abused and how readily people can be convinced to participate in systems of oppression.
It highlights the importance of critical thinking, questioning assumptions, recognizing the complexities of historical narratives.
Well said. I'm feeling more attuned to these patterns, more aware of how history can repeat itself in subtle and not so subtle ways.
That's the power of historical understanding. It helps us see the world with greater clarity and to recognize the connections between seemingly disparate events and ideas.
And it equips us to challenge injustice and to work towards a more equitable future.
Exactly. The past isn't just something to be studied, it's a resource to be drawn upon, a wellspring of wisdom and insight that can guide us in the present.
It's like a conversation across time, where we can learn from the mistakes and the triumphs of those who came before us.
And that conversation is essential if we're to create a future that's more just and compassionate than the past.
I couldn't agree more. This deep dive has been a real eye-opener, and I'm eager to keep exploring these themes. What else can we learn from comparing Ireland's experience to other empires?
One particularly interesting point of comparison is the role of intermarriage and assimilation in consolidating imperial power.
Okay, I'm curious. How did those dynamics play out in different empires? Was intermarriage encouraged or discouraged?
It varied depending on the context and the specific empire. In some cases, intermarriage was actively encouraged as a way to forge alliances and to create a more integrated society. For example, in the Mughal Empire in India, there was a significant amount of intermarriage between the ruling Muslim elite and the Hindu population.
So in that context, it was seen as a way to bridge those cultural divides
Yeah.
and to create a more unified empire.
Precisely. But in other cases, intermarriage was more fraught, often reflecting power imbalances and the desire of that dominant group to assert its cultural superiority.
Were there any examples of that in Ireland? Did the English encourage or discourage intermarriage with the Irish?
While there were certainly instances of intermarriage between the English and the Irish, it was often a complex and uneven dynamic. In some cases, it did represent a genuine kind of merging of cultures and identities, but in other cases, it was more about the English asserting their dominance and trying to assimilate the Irish into their way of life.
It sounds like intermarriage could be a tool of both unity and division, depending on the context
Huh.
and the power dynamics at play.
Exactly. And it's fascinating to see how those dynamics played out in different empires, revealing the complexities of cultural exchange and the challenges of forging a shared identity within a diverse society.
Makes you wonder how individuals navigated those complexities, how they balanced their own cultural heritage with the pressures to conform or assimilate. Did they resist or embrace those pressures?
Those are precisely the kinds of questions that historians are increasingly asking, moving beyond those grand narratives of empires to explore the lived experiences of those caught in the midst of these cultural and political transformations.
It's a reminder that history is ultimately about people, their choices, their relationships, and their struggles to make sense of the world around them.
And by listening to those individual stories, we gain a richer and more nuanced understanding of the past and its enduring legacies.
This has been an incredibly enlightening conversation, and I feel like we've only just begun to scratch the surface. There's so much more to explore about the history of Ireland and its place within this broader story of empire.
Absolutely. And what's so exciting about this field of study is that new discoveries are being made all the time, thanks to the work of historians like Professor Ohlmeyer and the availability of new sources and digital archives.
It's like a never-ending journey of discovery, with each new piece of information adding to the richness and complexity of the tapestry.
Exactly. And that's what makes history so endlessly fascinating.
Well, I'm definitely hooked,
Yeah.
and I'm sure our listeners are eager to learn more as well. But before we wrap up this deep dive, I have one final question. If someone wanted to delve deeper into this topic, where should they start?
I highly recommend checking out Professor Jane Ohlmeyer's book, Making Empire: Ireland, Imperialism, and the Early Modern World. It's a meticulously researched and thought-provoking work that challenges traditional narratives and offers a fresh perspective on the history of Ireland and empire.
That's an excellent recommendation. I'm adding it to my reading list right now.
Mm-hmm.
I imagine there are a lot of other resources out there too for, those of us who want to keep exploring this period in Irish history.
Oh, tons. Countless books, articles, documentaries, even other podcasts, that delve into this part of Ireland's past and its relationship with empire.
Sometimes I find that visiting historical sites
Yeah.
and museums can be a really powerful way to connect with the past.
Yeah, I agree. Ireland is just full of places where you can walk in the footsteps of those who lived through this era. Castles, landscapes, artifacts. Seeing those things firsthand really brings history to life.
Yeah, it's one thing to read about it, but another to experience it in a tangible way. Feel the weight of history. all around you.
It really does deepen our understanding in ways that books alone can't.
This deep dive has been a real journey for me. I feel like I've gained a much deeper appreciation, not just for Ireland's past, but for how that past continues to shape, the present.
That's the power of historical inquiry, isn't it? It's not just about the facts and dates. It's about using the past as a lens to view the world around us.
So as we wrap up this episode, what's one key takeaway you hope our listeners will walk away with? What's the most important thing you'd like them to remember?
I'd say the most important thing is to look beyond those simple narratives. The story of Ireland and empire is complex, multifaceted. You have heroes and villains, victims and perpetrators, and often individuals who embody all of those roles at once.
It's a good reminder that history is rarely black and white, full of shades of gray, competing perspectives, individuals making choices within systems that often feel so much larger than themselves.
And by embracing that complexity, being willing to challenge assumptions and listen to different voices, we can gain a much richer and more nuanced understanding of the past. And that understanding can help us navigate the complexities of the present, work towards a future that's more just and equitable for everyone.
Beautifully said. And on that note, I want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the history of Ireland and empire. It's been a pleasure learning alongside you and our listeners.
The pleasure was all mine. I always enjoy these conversations.
And for our listeners who want to keep exploring, be sure to check out the show notes. We'll have links to Professor Ohlmeyer's book and other resources we mentioned today.
And don't forget to subscribe to the Deep Dive for more fascinating explorations into the topics that matter to you.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning,
Yeah.
and keep learning.